So to start, just to give kind of an introduction, I was on the U.S.-Mexico border just a few days ago, working on something for CNN, but also keeping in mind this presentation and really my work in general. I'm always thinking about gender when I'm working on migration. And it's something that you'll see in a lot of my projects. One of my long-term projects has been to follow several trans women as they migrate from El Salvador to seek asylum in other countries. And so that's been the last few years of my life, reporting two of those stories. And what's new, of course, is that we have in the United States a new presidential administration. And I think we're all familiar with the changes that the Trump administration made with his racist views of immigrants, and in particular of Mexicans and Central Americans, and his policies separating mothers and children. And the question that I think a lot of people have, that I had when I went to the border last week, was what is happening now that Biden is in office? He's been in office, about roughly 4 months, and, what changes have been made. So I'm going to talk a little about that in the context of gender. Let's see. Great. Okay, so I went to McAllen, Texas, which is directly across from Reynosa, Mexico, and I crossed into Reynosa. I took this Polaroid in Reynosa. I really wanted to work with a Polaroid camera because it prints in the moment. It's something that migrants and kids can interact with. And it's something I can share with migrants. So that's kind of my thinking when I was working with the Polaroids. And what's happening right now is that I'm not sure if you all are familiar with Title 42. When the pandemic happened, President Trump put into law Title 42, which essentially says that he basically shut down asylum, used the pandemic as a pretext to shut down asylum, and said that it was a public health issue. And in reality, it is a violation of U.S. and international law because requesting asylum is an established right. It's certainly a process that you could do while testing individuals for COVID. There's no reason to shut down asylum. And so what I saw on the border is that Title 42, which was Trump legislation, under Biden, Title 42 is still in place, which means that the majority of asylum seekers who cross the border are going to directly and automatically be expelled. They're not allowed to request asylum. There is no process. They're apprehended and they're sent back to Mexico, regardless of what country they come from. And so that in itself, imagine you've come from, Honduras, Guatemala, Venezuela, and you're suddenly back in Mexico. You have no money. So you're not being deported back to your own country. So what's happening right now is if you go to Reynosa, there is a tent camp in the main park in Reynosa right after you cross the international bridge. So I walked across the international bridge. Reynosa is quite dangerous. It's cartel controlled territory. It's quite dangerous for migrants. They're often kidnapped. And so they're being deported to Reynosa. They're living in tents in a park, and you think, they can't necessarily go home because they don't have the money to get home. So they're all thinking, will Biden get rid of Title 42, and will I be able to request asylum, or what's going to happen to me. And there's several issues that are relevant to women, girls, and the LGBTQ community when thinking about the asylum process. For example, when I'm talking to girls, I interviewed a woman in Reynosa who she was 21. She had 2 kids, and I asked her. She was traveling with her husband, and she said one of her children was pretty old, and I said, "When did you first get pregnant?" And she said, age 12. So when you're thinking about, the first thing that comes to my mind is if you were 12 and your partner, as old her partner was, he was almost 30 years older than her, that's statutory rape. That's illegal. And I think this is a pretty common issue for girls living in countries where there's really not a strict enforcement of things related to, the definition of rape. And so, and she was illiterate. She had never been to school. She was from a rural area and an area that had been affected by climate change. Her family was a farming family. And so when I'm talking to girls and women, I'm always thinking, if I had not asked her, I thought, she's only 21 and her son looks like he's 8. So that means, how old was she when she got pregnant? And so then I asked, how old was your partner? And then I'm thinking, okay, this was statutory rape. And then when I'm asking, about her background, because she's never been to school. And so I think why has she never been to school? And that issue for women and girls is often connected to climate change, because if they're from farming families, if they're the only girl or one of who's expected to stay home and take care of the house when families are quite poor, they have limited economic resources, and who's going to stay home and who's going to go to school? Boys are going to go to school and the girls are going to stay home. And so I try, when I'm doing interviews, to always piece these things together, because it's not, someone like this young woman who is uneducated, who doesn't read or write. If I ask her, are you a climate change migrant, or have you been affected by climate change? She is not going to respond to that question. She's probably going to say she doesn't know what climate change is. And so when I'm doing interviews, I really think about how to frame these issues so that I can get to, there's always a gendered angle. If I just came in and said, here's a 21-year-old woman, she has 2 kids, and she fled violence, which is, a common story. And that's the story she told me, in the beginning. But if you dig deeper in these stories, there is always a gendered angle. In this case, it was climate change ruined the crops. Who had to stay home? The girls had to stay home. Who didn't get to go to school? The girls didn't get to go to school. Who then got pregnant at age 12 because she was raped. And so all these things, it's they're issues that put women at risk, women and girls at risk, not being educated, not being able to read or write, not knowing your rights, not knowing. And, she did not consider that what happened to her was rape. I mean, I don't think she had been, probably it wasn't presented to her that way. She was actually shamed. She told me that even the hospital staff, when she was giving birth, shamed her and, said, you're kind of worthless and, essentially like a slut. And so these are issues that are affecting women and girls in many countries in the US as well, but that it really depends on often on the context, the laws, and economics. And so these girls I talked to, they were living in the park in Reynosa. When I'm working with minors, I don't ever ask them to share their names. If they want to share a first name, they can. In this case, I asked the girl on the right with her sleeves rolled up if she wanted to write something on the Polaroid photo, and she did write her name, Stacy. And I don't know, most of you may speak Spanish, but if you look at what's written on the bottom, it says, "Do you think that there is asylum for me?" And this is an 8-year-old girl, and that's what she wrote on this photo. And I think that's pretty powerful, because she shouldn't even have to ask that question. She should be able to request asylum because it is her right. It doesn't mean she will get it or her family will get it, but she should be able to request it, and she shouldn't have to write that question. And so this photo, you might look at it and say, what's going on? I went to Roma, Texas, it's near McAllen. It is a point where migrants can pay to take a raft to cross the Rio Grande River. And they cross, it's a point where they cross and they turn themselves into, right there is Customs and Border Patrol agents are right there. So they're turning themselves in. And I think a lot of people think, oh, some migrants try and cross the border, undetected, but many migrants, as the law allows, cross the border and turn themselves into CBP and request asylum, which is, outside of the pandemic, was the law. And so here, I'll show you a photo of it. So you can see here, these are migrants crossing the river. The guy who's paddling the boat is paddling with his arms. And this was at night. It was around, midnight, 1 a.m. And probably 200 migrants, a lot of them children, and you'll see that in the photos that I'm going to show you, crossed the border and turned themselves in to request asylum. And many of them were unaccompanied minors, in particular 2 girls that I talked to. Okay, so you can see this man, he's handing a child off to get out of the raft. And it just gives you an idea of what migrants are going through, in the process of attempting to request asylum. And here you see a mother, son, and the heartbreaking thing was, so I was there on the banks of the river, and it wasn't necessarily easy to talk to everyone, because they were on their way to turn themselves into the Border Patrol. But I did talk to, there were several unaccompanied girls, and in particular an 8 and a 9-year-old from Guatemala who stopped me and said, what papers do I need to request asylum? Do I need my birth certificate? And I thought, here's a 9-year-old who's traveled alone, a 9-year-old girl, who's asking me if she can request asylum. And I had to tell her that, and it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to explain, because migrants aren't necessarily up to date on what's happening at the border. And many of them think that since Biden came into office, that Title 42 is gone, or that they can request asylum. And so part of me being there, and when migrants would ask me, I would explain Title 42 to them and say that there are some exceptions. You can enter the U.S. on a temporary, it's basically like a temporary hold. It's not asylum, but only a few categories of people are getting into the U.S. And it's hard to talk about that sometimes with migrants because many of them aren't in those categories. So here's a Polaroid. You can see everybody's wearing face masks. So we're still, in COVID times. Um, and there were a lot of children. This is still at the river. And um, and here you can see, I mean, you can get an idea of the number of children. And so there's several issues that women in the LGBTQ community are facing. And one of them, which I'm going to talk about, is we all know that during the Trump administration, he was separating families, when they crossed the border. And so I wasn't sure what was happening with Biden, but I did meet a mother who was separated from her son last week. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about her case. These are some girls who were in. So you saw the photos of people crossing in rafts, and so what's happening to most of those migrants is that they cross, they turn themselves into Border Patrol. They want to request asylum. Many of them don't know that they're not even going to get the opportunity to tell their story. They're not going to get to do anything. They're going to be immediately sent to Reynosa, to this, and then they're going to have to figure out, where am I living? What am I doing? How do I move forward? So the three kids that I met in Reynosa, who they had been expelled, deported with their parents. And this is you could call a chosen family. A lot of the migrants living in the tent camp. This chosen family, they're all sharing a tent, and part of it's economic. They don't necessarily have money coming in. They're not able to work necessarily. And you can see on the left side of the photo that one of the members of the photograph, one of the people in the photograph, were LGBT. So the person in the back in the white t-shirt is a trans man. And when I met him, he was going by both his birth name, Marta, and by his chosen name, Martin. So some of his friends were calling him Marta and others were calling him Martin. But he said, I'm a proud trans man. And I wanted to read something that he said to me. He was traveling, so he was a trans man traveling with his son, his 8-year-old son. You can see he's holding his son there. And he crossed the border to request asylum with his son. And he is a member of a community that is persecuted. The trans community, especially in Central America, is, faces a lot of discrimination. And I asked him why he wanted to cross the border. And he said, not being discriminated against is freedom. And he thought that he would find that in the U.S. And the the difficult part of his story is that he crossed with his son, and he is, in theory, a part of a group that should be given special consideration in terms of receiving entry into the United States, such as a temporary hold, because of, because he belongs to the trans community. But he was sent back to Mexico with his son, and so I was surprised, because often, especially members of the trans community, because of the violence they face, they will get some consideration for entry into the U.S., or, they can't request asylum right now. But I did follow, during the Trump administration, I followed a trans woman from El Salvador to the U.S. Through her, she requested asylum, and she did receive asylum during the Trump administration. So, and these are the kinds of stories of individuals who faced extreme discrimination, who faced death threats for being who they are, and then they want to come to the U.S. and study or work, very basic things that in their own countries they cannot do. And it's also the first trans man that I have met who is traveling with his child. And there he had an owl tattoo on his leg that he was showing to me. And so you can see this is a little bit of the situation where people are living. So Martin, the trans man, was sharing a tent with his son plus some other migrants he had met who he had befriended. And one of the beautiful things that I witnessed is I was working with a photographer who is also from the LGBTQ community. She's non-binary, and so when she met Martin, she recognized that he might be missing a binder. A binder is what flattens your chest, if you're not familiar. And she asked him, because that's something that can make a trans man feel much more comfortable. And she asked him, do you need a binder? And I'll try and get one for you. And so I'm saying this because I think representation is really important. And when I'm working, I try to work with photographers who are local, who are women, who are from the LGBTQ community. And, the photographer recognized that. I wouldn't have known to ask him if he needed a binder. So that was a moment that I was really glad to witness. And this is the mother who was separated from her son. So she's from Honduras. I was walking around the camp, basically just chatting with migrants who were interested in sharing their stories. And I ran into her, and I was asking where she was from, just chatting essentially. And she started crying. She's 55. She's from Honduras. And she just started crying and talking about God. And anyway, I said, what's wrong? And she said, just the border with her son to request them. When they crossed the border together, they were immediately separated. They were told, the mother, she said that she was told, you're going to separate buildings to be processed. And then when she was taken to a separate building, she was immediately deported to Mexico. And so For me, this is the first case of a mother being separated from her child that I have seen during the Biden administration. And she was crying, and what she said, and actually, if you look at the photo and you read the photo, I think it could make you cry. It says, "I love you, son. It wasn't my intention to leave you. You know that I was tricked. Take care, son." And she said they tricked me. She said, if I had known, and this is a quote, if I had known I was going to be deported, I would have told my son to come with me, but they sent him to another building. And for me, I mean, obviously, child separation, family separation is a violation of human rights. But aside from that, during the Trump administration and what I'm seeing now with this woman, it's done without ever telling the parents. They're tricking the parents. They're saying, "Oh, we're going to take your children to get a snack. Oh, we're going to take your children to shower. Oh," and then they deport, one parent or both parents. And she didn't want me to take a photo of her face. She didn't want to give me her name, which I understand. She was afraid of never seeing her son again or of being punished. And whenever I'm working with these kind of stories, I try and say, whatever you feel comfortable sharing is, what we'll work with. And I asked her if I could take a picture of her feet. And I think her feet tell a story too. So many migrants are wearing flip-flops or sandals and walking thousands of miles, hitchhiking, and their feet tell a story too. And I just want to make that point because a lot of difficult stories with women, with girls, with the LGBTQ community, they might not want to use their name. They might not want their photo to be taken. And you need to respect that because you can be creative. There are other ways to do things. There are many ways to tell a story, and you should never make someone feel that they have to risk themselves or their safety for you. Okay, this is Rena. She was actually the first migrant I met. She's 27. She has a 9-year-old daughter named Ashley. And the interesting thing about Rena and about the mother who was separated from her son, and is that I asked them, I mean, I always think about the context of what's going on in Central America. So in November, 2 large hurricanes passed through Central America, essentially destroying entire communities, houses, and Iota. And so I met a girl who was on the Guatemala-Mexico border. I was there about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I met a girl because if you've watched at least the U.S. news, there's this, they say there's so many coming to the U.S. Why are they coming? And I interviewed a girl who was orphaned by the hurricane. Both of her parents had been killed in a landslide, and she had migrated alone. And so in Reynosa, knowing that story, I was asking migrants, what happened to your family during Hurricanes Eta and Iota? And several of the women said, my house went underwater, family members died, crops destroyed, nothing left. And so many of these migrants, and I think this is a missing discourse right now at the U.S.-Mexico border because, there's like so many migrants and why are they here? Part of why they're here is because of climate change. And so that's something that I wanted to share. And this photo, I don't know if you look at it and you're like, what's going on here? Looks like he's, come out of surgery. So I met, his name is Kevin, and he wrote on this photo, God is with me. So he was getting a homemade facial from Rena, the woman I just showed you, Rena, and some other women. So the migrants need to make money when they're all looking for some small way to make money. So this group of women, including Rena, were giving essentially facials, like a face mask. It was homemade. It was made out of yogurt and sugar, to other migrants. And so I love this photo because it's unexpected. It's bending gender norms in some ways. It's a man getting a facial and women making money from this homemade facial. And it just gives you an idea of a lot of these women are traveling alone with children, and they have to continue supporting them, and they're being creative. And this is just such a lovely moment. And then this is Ashley with her daughter. So I wanted to get a picture of her with her daughter, but I didn't want to show her face. So her daughter was laying down eating an apple, and her daughter decorated this Polaroid, and she wrote, "God is loyal." A lot of the migrants were traveling with Bibles and, really counting on God to keep them safe, essentially. And so this is it's on the far right is a brother. Next to him is his sister's husband, their two kids, and then a friend. And I wanted to share the story of this photo because the young man on the far right, who's sitting on the very edge of the photo, he was traveling with his wife and his son. And because he does have some knowledge of what's happening in terms of who's getting across the border into the US right now, and one of the groups that is getting into the US that can get a temporary hold is women with children under the age of 6. And who's gets preference, I think, is changes depending on the administration, the laws. And I wasn't even aware exactly of who was getting in, but right now, women with children under the age of 6 are getting some preference. And so he said, he told his wife, cross with our son alone and I'll cross on my own. So his wife and his son are in the US. They did get it's a temporary status. And he crossed on his own. He got apprehended and deported. And so this is a case, an example, because sometimes, there's so many gendered ways that the laws are affecting migrants. Some women are separated from their children. In this case, the woman who was separated, her child was over 6. Some women are apparently given preference as long as the child is under 6. And then in this case, the husband was deported. So it gives you kind of a look at the fractured way that immigration law plays out in practice. And I wanted to go ahead and open up this space for questions or comments, anything that you're curious about. Does anybody have any questions? I'm not sure if I can see. or you can write me.
Thank you, Alice, for this very, very interesting presentation. You touched so many issues. So you can write down your comments or questions, or I was wondering, you mentioned this campsite in Mexico, Reynosa, where you have just been in, and I was wondering what Mexico seems to be a kind of in-between space where the immigrants kind of have to stay sometimes before they get over the border, but it's not their final destination. How do the Mexican society cope with this situation? How do they interact with immigrants? How do Mexican government is dealing with this massive waves of migrants in their territory? And do they eventually stay there? Do they make Mexico their homes? Or what is the role of Mexico in all this story?
That's a really good question, and it's complex because it really depends on the. So some migrants, for example, migrants who are trans or LGBTQ often do not want to stay in Mexico because the kind of discrimination and violence that they faced in El Salvador and Honduras, they will equally face in Mexico, and potentially the same gangs that were after them, attempting to kill them in Honduras or El Salvador will also be looking for them in Mexico. So that's one issue. That's one reason, certain groups don't want to stay in Mexico. The other issue is that Mexico, the president, AMLO, his strategy has been, he was very in agreement with Trump. His strategy for the border has been to militarize. He has sent the National Guard in large numbers, especially to the southern border, the Guatemala-Mexico border. I was there about 3 weeks ago, working with UNICEF, interviewing minors, and the border, I've never seen it this militarized. The presence of the National Guard. So and if you've seen any videos recently of migrants who've crossed in groups or caravans, the National Guard essentially beats them back. I mean, the strategy is a military one. It's not a recognition of any of the actual roots of the problem, in Central America. And even the National Guard, when I've had interactions with them, they're very, they want to see my press card. They want to see my passport. They're kind of, I would say, intimidating me, essentially. They told me that they needed to, take a photo of my ID because they had seen many unregistered journalists, which is what... I've never heard of that being a problem. Who's pretending to be a journalist and what's that problem? So they've militarized the border. And then the third part of the question is that some groups do stay in Mexico. For example, Haitians. A lot of the Haitian community basically started living in Tijuana, decided to open restaurants, and there's now quite a large, Haitian community living in Tijuana. So there's a mix of, of responses to the different issues at the border.
So you would say by now the first difficulty is crossing this southern border of Mexico and Central America. This is the first borderline.
It's very dangerous between gangs and the National Guard. That's what migrants say is really the hardest, territory to cross.
First, We have a question by Camila Torres Carrillo. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering, what do you think about the media coverage of the situation at the border during the Trump administration versus the Biden administration? How is it different?
What I have seen, with the Trump administration, I think the media should have been much more critical earlier. That's, for example, separating parents from children, that is illegal. That there's no gray area. There's no discussion. There should be there should be nothing to talk about when it comes to that, that kind of a quote unquote policy. It's not a policy. So I wish the media had held Trump's feet to the fire, because he deserved every bit of that, for essentially, trying to dehumanize and in some cases, putting people's lives at risk. And with Biden, I feel like there's been a lot of discussion of a crisis at the border, which I don't think that crisis is the correct term. I wish it was a more nuanced discussion, like a discussion of climate change and of all these, and the hurricanes and all these factors, because so many people I meet in the U.S., are like, well, what's happening? Why are these people, pouring in waves and all this kind of racist language? And it's not, it's not actually a mystery. Like, if you pay attention to what is happening, globally with climate change, with fires, with hurricanes, but it's like, we don't want to have that discussion. And so we're just, we're leaving it at crisis. And then in terms of Biden, I still feel like there's not enough coverage. For example, I don't know, why hasn't he changed Title 42? Is it because he's focusing on coronavirus? Is it because it's politically unpopular? Is it because he wants to, but he hasn't had time yet? Is it, I'm not sure. I was curious to see, and the mother separated from her son. I haven't seen that in the news, and I hope to write something about it for CNN. But I haven't seen anyone saying Biden is continuing, and it might not be technically him. It could be that the system that Trump put in place with his supporters and his picks for whatever, that system is still running and no one has corrected it. So there's a lot of, for me even, there's a lot of unknowns.
Another question by Julia Feist. Thank you so much for sharing your important work. I'm curious to hear more about your strategies in finding ways to tell story, especially when you have a particular assignment or need to find out specific information.
Well, I think one of the first things that I would my case is particular because I'm a freelancer, and I try to do a lot of my own stories and my own work, meaning I apply for, I come up with the idea, I apply for a grant, I get the money, I hire a photographer. So because I'm really interested, like these Polaroids, no news organization asked me to do Polaroids. No news organization even probably wants them, but it's something that I do as a long-term project, as part of a long-term project. And so often, I do assignments for CNN or for Time where they say, go here and find this. And that's, that is a challenge. Like when I was working for Time under the Trump administration, they gave me like 2 days to find a mother who'd been separated from her son. And that was hard. I basically flew to the border, was on the ground, going to all the places where I knew migrants were or where I knew people had been deported, because I needed to find a mother who'd been separated from her son and to tell that story. But in general, I'm interested in telling stories that, that weave in art, painting, video, photography, and I really try and do long-term work, so over a number of years. And I'm basically funding myself, or, in the sense that I'm writing grants based on my own projects that give me more creative control about who I'm hiring, what photographers I'm working with. And so those are the two, I do assignments, but I also try to do my own projects.
Thank you. Well, before I go to the next question, I have one myself related to this last one. Actually inspired by your book, The Ethics of Representation, you were talking there. Taking into consideration that Latin America is a region especially hidden by violence against women, what is the ethic role of art, or in this case journalism, trying to make visible these realities? How could you elaborate more on this ethics of representation you talk about in your book?
Well, one of the central issues for me in terms of my own exposure to violence against women is that it is historically defined by men and also photographed or represented by men. So even today, for example, internationally, of all the working news photographers in the world, less than 15% are women. So if you think about that, you are seeing 85% of all images were taken by men and 15% or less by women or non-binary members. And so this has an impact. The way that you take a photo or describe violence, I have traditionally seen, and I see this a lot even now, men there's a sensational aspect of violence against women, of showing, dead bodies, mutilated bodies, underwear, all these really gory details that maybe they do sell newspapers. And also in descriptions of, male writers, and it's of describing, and even in Mexico City in the past year, there's been some very extreme cases of violence. A woman whose husband, killed her and took out her innards essentially and threw them on the street. And in those cases in Mexico, it was photos and blood and descriptions. And there are ways to respect a woman, to respect her who she is, her story, and to recount the impact of violence without doing this sensational blood. It's an exploitation, in my opinion, of violence against women, because that's not the only way to do it. And so with art, and this is what I loved when I was writing my book, women, because it was the mothers of disappeared daughters, they taking representation into their own hands and saying, this is my daughter, this is her bedroom, she loved playing baseball, and they were putting up crosses and photos, and they were taking representation into their own hands because they had seen the media and they had seen the police, who had really, in a sense, re-victimized their daughters. And so I think art and photography, and in all of that, representation, who's taking the photo, who's making the art, and really we need to increase diversity. 85% of men taking photos, that is not acceptable, in my opinion.
Yeah, great issue. Thank you. Svetla Dimitrova asking, thank you for your presentation and your work at the border. are any of the migrants commenting on what it would take for them to go back home? What kinds of changes need to happen in their own country in order for them to feel safe?
So there's I'll just describe a couple of general situations, with that we're focusing on with the LGBTQ community. It's unlikely, the level of discrimination. I mean, many of them have survived an assassination attempt, usually either by gangs or by the police. And some of them, the trans woman one of the trans women I followed in 2017 from out of El Salvador, she had survived multiple assassination attempts. She had scars. She had a scar, across her neck. She had been stabbed with an ice pick. Just things that you and I cannot imagine. And so for the LGBTQ community, the kind of changes that they need to take place will probably take decades or a lifetime. And so they recognize that. And even the other day, someone asked me, don't they want to stay and make their community better? And they do. For example, one of the trans women she now has asylum in Switzerland, but she stayed in El Salvador. She founded an NGO. It was the first NGO entry to support the LGBTQ community. And she became quite well known for her work. She was doing amazing work in very difficult conditions. And, you ask, how did she end up in Switzerland? Well, she had been threatened by gangs and for her work and for who she was, but they started to threaten to kill her mother. And that's when she said, I have to leave. And so she and her mother now have asylum in Switzerland. They are studying French. It's an amazing story in some respects, but it's incredibly sad because they wanted to stay, she wanted to stay and make her country a better place for the LGBT community, and she couldn't. So that's just one example of, the difficulty of, that some migrants face when they're making those kinds of decisions. Like, if I go back, I'm probably going to die. And for the LGBT community, I do think that is often a realistic assessment of what would happen.
Question by Jana. Thank you very much, Alice. As we just talked about migration laws, as far as I know, domestic violence is still not a reason to be granted asylum because it is considered private violence compared to the public violence of government persecution, for example. In your opinion, what would need to be done to protect victims of gendered violence at the border?
So that is true, and my understanding of that is that I think it was under Trump that change was made, that he made that change, that domestic violence would no longer be considered a reason for requesting asylum. I might need to check on that, but I believe that's the case. And I absolutely think it should be a category. It should be a valid reason for requesting asylum. And it's just, to me, it's another way in which a system very much run by men, controlled by men, overwhelmingly, statistically, ignores issues that dramatically affect the lives, the livelihoods of girls and women. And it's often not a simple issue of, just change cities. I mean, a lot of it is also often tied up with gang violence, with its, a masculinity that's so threatened by women by that they will literally try and kill them anywhere. And so I think there's often a misunderstanding of the level of violence and the types of violence that women and girls face. And I wish that would be considered in requesting asylum.
Another one by Paula Fields. Thank you for sharing with us today. In order to take your photos, you have to go out there. Have you ever felt in danger? If so, what do you do to protect yourself?
I do work in high conflict areas. Mexico is the most dangerous country for journalists outside of a war zone. It does, even though it's not technically at war, it does, many areas are considered high conflict areas, and I do work in them. I've always, I don't want to limit my work, and I also always felt very strongly that, men have always worked war zones and conflict areas, and men have always defined. I really disagree with some of the ways that the masculinity, the focus on violence is always a man thing. It's cartels, it's drug lords, it's guns, and I just don't think, I think it's much more complex than that. And so I always wanted to work in these areas. I wanted to focus on girls and women in the LGBTQ community. And I wanted to say, I am perfectly capable of doing this. And so one of the things that I do is that I regularly, every 2 or 3 years, I take, it's called a hostile environment training. It's basically a week-long training, and you go through different scenarios. You're outside, you're training, you get kidnapped. It's like preparing for you for what would happen if you got kidnapped, or different situations, gunfire. And so I feel like all of working in high conflict areas is also planning. Not that you can control everything, you can't, but you can control a lot of factors with planning, with research, with, being very careful about the work that you're doing.
Well, maybe the very last question, as we are running out of time. Anna Boyasis, Alice, thank you for the important work that you're doing. Could you provide an example of a conversation you've had with someone who's not comfortable being photographed as a bridge toward photographing them in a way that will not disclose their identity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the photos in the presentation, and this would have been like 3 or 4 days ago when I was in Reynosa, and I met the woman who'd been separated from her child, and I said, this is a story, this story would go viral. And, normally in journalism, you do want the name of the person, you do want as many details as you can get to confirm the identity in their story. But in her case, she told me, I'm not going to tell you my name, I don't want to, and I don't want you to photograph me. And so I said, and I was looking at her, and I said, what, could I photograph your feet? I just want, I want an image that will help tell your story, and you can write on the image. And I think she really liked the idea of writing a note. I said, you can write a note to your son. And so part of it is just being empathetic with the people that you're working with, and thinking, what respects them. And I don't need a photo of her face. I think the photo of her feet with that note tells you, I look at it and it makes me cry.
Well, thank you so much, Alice, for sharing with us today all these stories, and bringing to light some of these realities that most of the time stay behind of the camera, or behind of the script of the media. And for bringing up also so many topics that are so interesting, talking about like this relation between migration and climate change. I think we should really go deeper into this subject, as it is going to be evolving in the next years, probably in a way that affects us all every time more. So thank you all for staying with us today. And thank you, Alice, for your work. I think it's very brave for you being in the front. And I hope we can hear more from you and your work.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate specifically this discussion. This topic is something I really like sharing. So I'm grateful to share that space with everyone.
It was a pleasure for us.